welcome. Thank you for coming. We'll get rolling here because I want to honor your time and Colleen's time, and a few more people may join us. I'm Sheila Riley, head of school at Star Academy. For those of you who I don't know, welcome. It's great to have you here. And when I first started at Star last year and started in conversations with parents and teachers about high school programs and post-high school programs for our kids, the thing that my big takeaway was we need to start this conversation a lot earlier. So this event today is the first in a series of events that we'll be offering this year about looking at the options for kids early on. And the great news is the options are exploding in the post-secondary landscape. So it's a really exciting time. And what we thought might not have been possible 5 years ago is certainly possible, and especially here in California, as Colleen and I were talking about. And make sure, please, that Lisa's got your email, so we keep you updated on. We're adding new course offerings throughout this year, so please keep in the loop. Colleen Arnold is a friend of Star Community. She has been a wonderful support here. We brought her into professional development for our teachers last year. Happily, I encountered her in IEP meetings as a wonderful educational advocate for some of the parents of the kids here. Her perspective is unique in that she's got 10 years of special education teaching, general education teaching. She's got a master's in education, soon to be her doctorate in special education. She's a professor at Dominican, so she sees and understands the complexities of the issues that we face, both as parents and teachers, and she understands the systems to which the complicated world of special ed operates. So she is well qualified to have this conversation with us, and she's a great and dynamic presenter. So thanks, Colleen. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Sheila. Thanks for having us. I just want to start by saying when I was first approached and through Professionals Empowering Parents, whom is partnering with STAR for this speaker series, I just thought, oh my gosh, transition. This is such a critical piece. And as Sheila stated, sometimes we just wait too long. We start having these conversations when we're thinking about college and not really when we should be starting, which is kindergarten. But that's just my bias. So I look at today as the beginning of a conversation. And I may not be able to answer every single one of your questions, but this is the jumping off point. And luckily I have Sheila and her expertise as well to jump in as needed. So I think about the focus really of today is the diploma versus the certificate, what the options are, what it might look like for your child, what are the ramifications of both decisions, and how the IEP plays a role in that conversation and decision. I would also just like to thank you for having me today, and we'll be streaming, which is really exciting. I'm excited to have these students here helping us make this presentation accessible to more families. So generally speaking, here in California, our students have two options of completing high school. And these options are what we call a certificate of completion or the more traditional high school diploma. When I use the word certificate of completion, that is not actually an educational award. It's something that we need to recognize. It is allowed by the Ed Code that high schools can give a certificate of completion, but it is limited in some ways in our steps for the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about those details. As we go, if you have questions that apply to the general group, please feel free to stop me. I tend to be fast and passionate when I get going, so sometimes I need a nice reminder to slow down. If you have questions that are really specific to your child, I am happy to stay after and speak with you about those more specific issues. But definitely if you have a question that you think would benefit the group, again, slow me down and stop me. I'm happy to answer. Okay, so while we have these two choices, I think what's most critical for me as an advocate is that these paths can and should look different for each child. I use the word track very loosely because when I think of a track, I think of two options that are very linear and they're without deviation. And that's what I struggle with as an educator. So for example, you might have a student who, through evidence and through the IEP, you're saying, okay, we're really looking at a certificate of completion here based on where their skills are, based on assessments, and what we've seen through the years. But that being said, all of our children have real patterns of strengths and areas of need, right? We might have a child where math is a real area of difficulty, but they are voracious readers who can access grade level content in that area. So this is something to really keep in mind when I think of the paths. I don't want us to visualize these two tracks that we don't deviate from. I want us as a team, IEP and a family team, to think about how we can be creative in really meeting the needs of our kids. And we'll talk more about that as we go through today. Okay, so what is the certificate of completion? So what we're looking at is it's an eligibility for students who have an IEP. It's specifically looking at for students who are not able to meet the state requirements for graduation. And we're going to look at how the state requirements, which are more of these basic requirements, may differ from what a state college might look for, or definitely do differ, as well as a university, right? And it's also a piece that I think is really important, is that regardless if a child is able to complete the necessary coursework to have a diploma, they still deserve to be recognized, right? They have had years of efforts, course completion, they have attended high school, and it really is a way to recognize our students for all of their growth throughout their 4 years in high school. So I really want to emphasize how important that is, that both of these are celebrated as a part of high school. There you go. Thanks for coming. So both are celebrated. When we think about graduation and we think about, you know, the caps being thrown in the air and this real movement towards the next phase in life. And I think obviously both diploma and certificate students get to have that feeling of success and moving on. Okay, so where in the IEP is this handled? So there's a couple of different things that I want to point out today that are really critical. The first is, and obviously you'll go home and you can find this page of your IEP, because unlike me, you might not be able to conjure up the image of the offer of fate page, or maybe you do. Maybe this is your 20th IEP and you know exactly what page I'm talking about. But there is a page in the IEP that looks at transition. And this is aside from the more complicated transition plan document. So one is promotion criteria. Okay, so on this page, and this is a great question for your team and to ask yourself, what it says is, is the child going to move from grade to grade based on the district standards? So those would be the Common Core grade level standards, meaning my child is going to move from 3rd grade to 4th grade because they were able to meet all of the 3rd grade standards, okay? Or the second option, which would be the box right here, which states they're going to move from grade to grade based on the progress towards their individual IEP goals. So what have we learned? We've learned in education as a whole that retention doesn't really work. It used to be a pretty common intervention. We would hold kids back who were struggling. We would have them repeat 5th grade. We would have them repeat 8th grade. But what the research tells us is that's not an effective way to help a child succeed. You may still see in Marin County, it's rare, but you may still see a child held back in kindergarten because that's developmentally, they see less harmful social emotional effects, but generally you're not seeing this later in life. So this is why what this box on the IEP says is it's saying, you know what, we recognize that Johnny can't meet the state standards at this time. They will be continued to move through the grades, and we're going to base it on the progress towards their IEP goals. So I'm not sure where our audience is right now, but I'm hoping that we have some parents of students who are not yet in high school. Is that true? Awesome, great, okay. So this is a great question to think about before we even touch high school and start talking about graduation and diplomas, because this is really the stepping stone. But again, we need to be having these conversations at every IEP. It shouldn't be, oh my gosh, we're in 7th grade, we're in 9th grade, we're in 11th grade, and suddenly we're talking about which track, okay? So where else on the IEP? Well, on this page, this offer of page, you'll also see what's highlighted as a graduation plan. So legally, and I'll talk a little more about IDEA, not the most exciting content. Legally, the IEP team has to talk about graduation, 7th grade and higher. That's what IDEA tells us. So that's why there's this box on the form, because the IEP forms are created to help teachers and administration follow the regulations of IDEA. So you'll notice, and I know it's kind of small, it says graduation plan, grade 7 and higher. It has the projected graduation date, and it has 2 boxes, to participate in curriculum leading to a diploma, and the other choice, to participate in curriculum leading to a certificate of completion. So from 7th grade, this is a conversation that's being had. Any questions about this page of the form? Again, you might run home and, what does that page? Yeah, absolutely. I'd be interested to see. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we decide which box to check, because that's a really important team conversation. And it not only has to do with your child's present levels, but it has to do with the long-term vision and goals that you have as a family, and that as your child gets older, they have as well for themselves and their future success.
Can that be changed?
Absolutely. That's absolutely why we want to be talking about this yearly. Sheila, my sister, is actually a guidance, I'm not a guidance counselor, so this units, it's not my expertise, but my sister is. So she was actually consulting high school classes. And Sheila, correct me if I'm wrong, but if your child was to take a class in 9th grade that was not a certificate class, meaning it wasn't a credit-bearing graduation course, and you guys decided actually they're ready for a diploma, they would have to retake that English class or that math class to be a credit-bearing class.
In what grade?
If that makes sense. So that's high school.
Oh, high school.
That's high school, yeah. But middle school does set the stage for high school. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's a good point. What we've done here at STAR, I mean, the gateway, as Colleen will go into later, is math, the algebra, ability to pass algebra or not pass algebra is what stands between a child and a high school degree in California. So the way we design our curriculum is it's not so straightforward
I think I just
the
got
child who can't do algebra also can't do higher language arts. So we don't track them necessarily if they're certificate track. All their classes are leveled at certificate track. We have kids who can't do the math, but who are really strong in the language arts. So they're still in the diploma track language arts, but they're in their certificate track math class. And they're getting a certificate. They're not getting a degree because they can't pass the Algebra 1. In California, that's the requirement right now. But we're still keeping that bar, pushing them up to the highest of their ability level in other subject content areas. Does that make sense?
So you can get you can get a split diploma?
No, you have, it's the math. The math is the gateway. So, you know, the child either can pass the algebra and gets the diploma, or cannot pass the algebra and gets the certificate.
But they're still pushed in their strength.
That's right.
Yeah, okay, good.
And that is what I was addressing with the paths and why I do try to avoid the word track, because best practice to me is this dipping back and forth. It is, you know, we have a shared student who might be reading on a 2nd grade level, but he could school us all in the area of bird knowledge. So we want to be able, we don't want to say, well, I'm sorry, you're on this track, so therefore you can only take these courses. That's extremely limiting. And the math piece is, and I am going to get there, but the math piece can be a really big stumbling block for our kids. I mean, Algebra 1 sure was for me. Yes, Judith.
What if the classes are modified?
That's a great question, and that is where I'm heading. Okay. So when I get there, if I don't fully answer it, please let me know. Oh, good, perfect timing. Thank you for that side note. Okay, so this is one page in the IEP that we need to pay attention to when we think about this transition. So there is a document, and I'm happy to share it. When I found it, it was like, I've been doing this a long time, it was like I struck gold. It's a 150-page document. It was created by the state SELPA, the California state SELPA that oversees all SELPAs in California. And it's essentially a document that tells you how to write an IEP for educational benefit, where, oh my gosh, all my teachers, well, I'd love for them to read all 145 pages, we can pull out little gems that help us understand how to use the form. So I just loved this note that was written by the state SELPA because it totally aligns with how I feel. And that is, the IEP team must use caution when determining if the student will be working towards a diploma or a certificate of completion. Students must have the opportunity to work toward a diploma if he or she has the ability to do so. This must be considered on an annual basis. Check appropriate box. So to me, that's the state SELPA saying, hey, this is not a decision that we just check a box and move on. This is where we're really thinking about our kid, where they are, where they've come, and exposing them, because we know that our development does not happen in a linear fashion. We often have explosion years, right? Where all of a sudden we've been working on this thing for a while and the light bulb goes off and things connect. So we want to keep that in mind, right? The trajectory is not always this smooth upward path. So where's the other part of the IEP that this is reflected in would be the transition plan. Okay, and I'm sure those of us that are in high school have those transition plan conversations in their IEP. It is required at age 16, although best practice suggests, and it used to be age 14. So that's something to think about, that if the IEP team deems that the child requires it earlier, that's something that you can really push for. It must address the following. Okay, so these are the three kind of magic areas that we want to think about. Education and training, employment goals, and independent living goals. Now, for me, the key here is student-centered. The key is, how do we take our students' strengths and interests to find this happy medium and look at their vision for their own future. Okay, so the ITP plays a big role in this. And what IDEA says, first of all, is that if you're talking about transition, the child needs to be there to whatever extent possible. That may look different for all of our kids. Some kids might be able to lead their own transition meeting. For some, just attending and sharing their interests using alternative communication. That might be their role, right? We have to be very flexible. IDEA also says that these post-secondary goals must be measurable. And I'll be honest with you, I sit in a lot of IEPs, and I see a lot of transition goals. And I push parents to really think about, let's not do cookie cutter, right? I know we've all seen it where it's like the same goal, well, I've seen it, the same goal for the 40 kids in the program. This is the most important, in my opinion, part of your IEP once you reach high school. This is thinking about your child's future, independence, whatever that looks like, maximum independence for your student. So for example, what IDEA says is the employment and education goals have to be related. If your child wants to work, for example, as a firefighter, we have to think about what educational goals they need to reach to get there. So for example, if the goal is to be a full-time firefighter, then the education goal might be to graduate from the fire academy. So then we have to backpedal. Okay, so what do you need? What does the fire academy require? What types of courses? What types of, does it require a certificate of a diploma? That's an important conversation too, right? If the child isn't there, then how do we scaffold and find a career path that maybe is similar but fits where they are at that point?
But isn't that really tricky even for a neurotypical child? Who knows
Absolutely.
what they want to do when they're 14 years old?
Absolutely, and we don't have to. I think the exploration is huge. I think the exposure to different, I mean, what I found in my life is I didn't know what I wanted to do, but with experience, I knew what I didn't want to do, right? It was like, oh my gosh, IHOP. Sorry, I did it for 2 years. It was my first job. I had the skirt with the fluffy sleeves. I'm dating myself now. But I was like, okay, this was a good experience for me, but food service is not like my long term, right? So sometimes you're absolutely right. This is not like make a decision and stick to it. This is let's experience and try and then come back every year and say, okay, well, here's a couple things off the list, right? And yeah, I have a senior I meet every week, and we're still exploring that. So it's not set in stone. It's more about the experience and the exposure.
And I was going to add, I think like for me, I feel like I want to not limit my son's options, and so he has aspirations that I think maybe are bigger than I would have expected, and so I'm now trying to figure out, is that really possible? And let's set the bar there rather than lower. So that's sort of like, even though we don't know what he's going to do, and obviously we can't predict his career, right? And 13 or 14, how do you know what they're going to do at 23? I've changed careers 5 times. So,
Totally.
you know what I mean? Like, but it's like, how do you not limit? I don't want to also not give him the opportunity. So I'd rather be talking about what's your biggest aspiration. Let's head towards that. Maybe you're not going to get there, but if you're not heading in that direction, you're definitely not going to get there. Right?
Absolutely. And to think about, even as a parent, I'm always battling that as an advocate. What is the goal? Keeping that bar high, and maybe we settle somewhere in the middle, but that's okay. Yes?
Yeah, it's something we address as parents all the time. I've got 2 daughters, one who is IDD and one who's mainstream, and between that and interviewing kids out of college, you remember, you go in, you really don't know what you want, 14, 16, 18, 19, 20, a lot of times in college. But I always found something that's helpful is, reinforcing a little bit what you said, is find what the kid is passionate about. Say, don't think about a job. What are you passionate about, so you can kind of direct what kind of person you are. You as a parent would know what limitations or hurdles your child will face. But it could be very simple, like, is that person really very myopic, very hyper-focused, likes to study and unearth and research, or a very sociable type of person, introvert, extrovert. And then you can kind of get a sense on, okay, is there a topic? My daughter, for example, wants to get into jewelry design, and she really took to it. She researches the heck out of it, but then sometimes she'll say, well, I'd like to work in a jewelry store, and you can remind her to brush her teeth all the time.
Yeah.
So finding that little early steps, and then if the child's old enough, it's always fun to introduce them to somebody who's actually in that field, who, a family friend or something who knows the child, to kind of give them a perspective. So it's just like little steps there, and remember, we all have time for them to find their calling.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I love that personal experience. It's really helpful.
If the goal that's spelled out by the child, let's say that this is very specific and the family has no experience in what it requires to go to the fire academy, let's say.
Right.
Does that require the district to then do or help do the research and say, okay, if you want to do that, then you have to do this and this and this and this?
It's an excellent point. That could absolutely be an exploratory IEP goal related to the transition plan. So I've seen goals, for example, so to take this firefighter, it's just a nice concrete example where the goal, oh, perfect, even better, where the goal is, okay, so between freshman and sophomore year, you're going to research what the qualifications are, what are the local programs, what does it take to get in, what type of documentation do you need. You're going to make a list of activities to help you gain some of those skills, right? So that, absolutely, that's the idea, is that the ITP is very concrete in helping them to bridge that gap.
So
And
the student is doing that research with the help of the teachers.
absolutely, absolutely. And I'm a big believer, and I think it'll come on this next slide. But we're thinking about those gaps that we were talking about. Okay, so here's where you are, here's what you need. Maybe, for example, you know, we know in the fire academy it's a lot of physical fitness. There's a lot of so maybe there are goals that need to be related to that piece, to improve your mile time, or things that can translate, and looking at those gaps. And the goals are, you know, one thing I've seen as an advocate where I always have my red flags, where I read something and I'm like, okay, I have to look deeper into this. And one of my red flags is I'll see the transition plan that says the student will write an essay. Okay, well that's an academic goal, that's a meaningful academic goal, but to double dip, and I've seen it, schools do it, and to say that the narrative essay is also serving as a transition goal, I struggle with that, right? This is supposed to be very specific to, maybe you can figure out a way to bring in writing, but I don't see that being a transition goal. I see that being an academic writing goal. So that's something to think about. The other thing to think about is once your child is moving towards the age of 18, where you're no longer perhaps their rights holder, that the student has to be informed about their rights a year prior, so at 17. And if your child is conserved, then you just need to file that paperwork and make sure that's a part of the file. So, great question. How are these courses different? Susan, before I move on.
Yeah, just one step back.
Sure.
The difference, I mean, my daughter's 18 and started her senior year in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet conserved, like a fine jam, but does it make a difference if you're going into your senior year IEP and your kid is conserved?
Does it make a difference in regards to?
In terms of how, who gets to speak for their rights, and, you know, I would think it would put the parent back in the advocacy role.
Mm-hmm.
But, so that's one part of the question. Second part is, you know, is it a good idea to go in when your kid's conserved?
Go into the IEP?
Yeah.
Yes, I absolutely, and maybe Sheila has more experience with this, but when your child is conserved, absolutely, the rights remain on you. I still go back to like the person-centered approach where your child is still the center of this, obviously. It's what you do every day. But you are essentially still holding those educational rights. So the final decision, approving the goals, that type of thing would still be your responsibility. Is there anything you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add is if your plan is to conserve your child, and that's obviously a very individual choice, to do it by 18 if that is your goal, because then you do retain that authority of signing off on the IEP. And if that conversation's evolving, then it's different. Your child's there with you at the IEP, but it's a complex issue, the conservatorship issue, and something, if you're even considering it, I'd start that conversation with your lawyer at 16 and really be thinking about it, but have come to a decision by the time they're 18, so things continue going in the direction you want them to go. Because as we know, sometimes an 18-year-old who may not see the long-term ramifications of what they say in an IEP meeting, you just want to be careful about that if you're thinking that they will be a child who you will be conserving.
Is there another way besides conservatorship to retain the educational rights? Like have the student agree to keep you as their rights decision maker?
So Alexis Lynch, our legal representative, is a part of this series. That is a question I would defer to her, but please write it down for me. And I know I'm gonna walk away from today with some questions that I cannot answer, but I'm happy to follow up regarding that. So we talk about these two types of diplomas, but what is different about the courses and the classwork? This is a question I get a lot. So if your child, and again, it doesn't have to be a track, it can be just a sole class. If they're in a diploma curriculum class, it is based on the Common Core state standards. I highly recommend the California Department of Education and the Common Core website I find really difficult to navigate, but there's an amazing Common Core app. So if you really want to see, oh my gosh, and sometimes it's shocking, what is a 12th grader expected to be able to do in science? I highly recommend downloading the Common Core app, pulling up 12th grade. It's super easy to navigate. 12th grade, social science, and it will list those standards. I know we get kind of pigeonholed, so I have to remember, like, okay, what are those broader goals? So the curriculum is standard. They're using whatever adoption or textbook has been deemed by the district. And the assignments and the load of the course are equivalent to those standards, okay, that have been determined by the school district. That's not to be said that there cannot be accommodations, and we're going to get to the difference between the accommodation and the modification, which are really, really critical at this juncture. When we talk about certificate courses, this is a course that addresses standards outside of the grade level, right? So the algebra is a perfect example. You might have a child who really needs basic life skill math, and this abstract algebra is really too much. And the one class in my life that I failed, I'm a school person, that's my thing, was algebra in college. And hopefully in May I will be a doctor. So it is not necessarily a lifelong hurdle that means you never get a degree. So I'm just going to put that out there. The curriculum in a certificate course is individualized to the IEP goals. It's not necessarily looking at the breadth of standards, right, even outside of a grade level for those of our kids who need real repeated instruction. And the assignments in the course load are modified. Modified is a word in special education that we have to use really carefully. It's not, in real life we can say, oh, we modified it, and it just means to alter it or change it. In special ed, it has a very different meaning. So you want to really pay attention as a parent when that word is used.
Yeah, that's my question. So I understand that my son's working towards a diploma, but he has a modified curriculum, so I'm confused about that. I don't understand how you can get both.
Well, number one, I would ask how they're defining modified, because in special education terms, and maybe I'll come back to this. When we talk about an accommodation, the key to the accommodation is that it is not fundamentally altering the expectation of the course and of the standards, okay? It's giving access to the child so the child can access the curriculum. So examples would be extra time on a test. It might be, an accommodation could be breaks. It could be a week, 7 days extra to turn in homework, but the homework and the content is the same. It could be long-term assignments. This is a big issue in high school. Long-term assignments broken up into smaller due dates and chunks, right? So these are all examples of ways to help your child access the same standards and the same expectations. When we come to a modification, this is why I say we have to use this word carefully, we're fundamentally lowering the standards and the expectations of that course, okay? We're providing the learning experiences that are individual, and this does impact grading and credit. So I guess my question for your IEP team would be, is it really an accommodation or a modification? Because if it is truly modified, and you know, like I said, my sister, the high school counselor, has been on a soapbox helping me comprehend these complex pieces, it is not credit that's going to lead to a diploma. So perhaps they're modifications, exactly. So that is definitive. Unless your school is using the wrong language and they really mean, I have teachers sometimes that will use that word, and gen ed teachers usually, and I say, okay, let's rewind a second. You're making changes, but are you fundamentally changing the learning outcomes, right? That's an important question. Yeah.
So I think I'm assuming a lot of us know Algebra 1 is the key difference between going certificate versus Diploma Track. But everything else, so posing the question in our IEP or with our teachers, because unfortunately some of us have gotten into the school system a little late, and we're chasing.
Sure.
So as far as when we sit down and look at the coursework that our child is participating in, knowing that she's recently switched to certificate track, and if we think, well, wait a minute, maybe if it's only Algebra 1, maybe it's something we could put extra focus on, K asking those questions as far as the rest of the curriculum?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And Sheila, jump in. I see Algebra 1 as a big sticking point, but there are 13 mandatory courses, and I'm going to show you in a second, that are required to get a diploma. So yes, the Algebra 1, because there's not a whole lot of wiggle room, like the content is the content, whereas I'd say in an English class, you can make more alterations and call it still. Would you agree? Like a diploma class?
I would say it's changing just like in the last 6 months in
Right.
terms of, okay, so what does that mean past Algebra 1? What does that mean Marin County? Is it this curriculum, this set of standards? And it's really hard to pin people down on exactly what that is. So we're looking at all different kinds of options for those kids who are fluent in everything else and
Right.
great standing academically across the board, but they can't pass that regular paced algebra class. What if we take 4 years and we do a different math curriculum? So these are the ideas we're playing with. And then the one other thing, because I don't want to steal your
Oh, no, please.
in answer to your question, and the way we work with our school districts for kids who are placed at STAR on an IEP is every year we give a copy of the high school transcript. Principal, a district at the home district, we're saying this child's on an academic track to receive a high school diploma from your school district. Review the transcripts and let us know that we are on the same track, we're of the same mind. And if there's any discrepancy, we want to know about it, because we'll make sure we cover that in their program here. So the conversation, if your child's at an NPS school, that you need to make sure that the NPS and the home district are in conversation and reviewing the transcript. So when your NPS says, yes, diploma from San Francisco's looked at the transcript and says, yep, we agree, you're meeting all the requirements, and you get that diploma. Those two pieces need to be moving in tandem.
Absolutely. The transcript is key, and understanding what the units look like. Because in some schools, when you are in, and I'm not sure how STAR handles it, when you are in a certificate class, it does not show up as units on your transcript, because it became really confusing for analyzing a transcript. So in some schools, it's the 5 credits only if it's a certificate class, or diploma class, sorry.
It's a little different here in that we have the credits on the transcript, but STAR, the NPS issues the certificate of completion, the districts don't. So child gets a certificate from our program that they recognize as a certificate of completion, and the JCs recognize, most importantly, as a certificate of completion. So now that child can go and take a JC class, no problem.
Great.
But STAR offers both a diploma and a certificate.
That's right.
Okay.
But the diploma is really from the county?
If they're a child placed here on an IEP, the home district will be issuing a diploma. If they're a privately placed student, whose their parents are paying, IEP is not funding the placement, and the child is a diploma track student, they'll get a STAR diploma. We are a WASC accredited high school, so we can issue a diploma that is then recognized by the junior college system.
Great. Super helpful. You're never stealing. I'm always learning from everyone, that's for sure. So when you think about your own child, oh, sorry, Steve, you did have your hand up earlier.
So, speaking inaccurately with teachers, they may say modification, they may say accommodation, but once it's placed on the IEP, that seems like that's a legal term, right?
Yes,
So
it
it's
is a
either
legal
gonna be
term.
accommodated or modified.
Correct.
And
But
that's
more,
no
but to
wiggle
me,
room there.
more importantly is because when it comes to looking at your child graduating, they're going to be looking at the transcript. So that's the most critical conversation to be having, is are these classes credit bearing towards a diploma?
So even if something is modified, they could still get a diploma. Is that accurate or not?
Well, it must be accurate, because my son right now is a senior at the local high school with an IEP on a diploma track, doubling up on algebra to try and pass Algebra 1 by the end of his senior year.
Right.
And he has modified throughout his transcript, and he's still on the diploma track. So
I would just make sure that everyone is, as long as everyone is on the same page, and that includes the guidance counselor, who is the individual who will actually say, yes, I recommend. The language may be different, but if it is a truly modified class, that is a certificate class. So just be very clear. Just be very clear.
So let's just say it's science, and you
Yep.
have to, the
Yeah, so it's checked on the IEP.
It's checked on the IEP that he's going towards a diploma, and it has been throughout.
Great.
But they keep saying modification,
But it is like
modification.
modified English. He's
I
taking
have to
modified
say,
English.
from a legal standpoint, I think they tick diploma automatically because they're aware that they shouldn't foreshorten a student's option. But I think realistically, they're not really thinking diploma.
So the question I would write down is, are these courses credit bearing towards a high school diploma? That is the key question. That is the key question to ask.
So I'm looking back at, so like for my own son's IEPs,
Yeah.
when he was, before he started at STAR, he had, his promotion criteria was district,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's progress on goals.
Okay.
And I've asked all along, diploma track, right? Okay, we're on a diploma track. And then I just found out actually last winter that this is a modified curriculum at STAR, which I didn't understand. I thought it was aligned with Common Core, and then it was a regular curriculum that was with accommodations and supports for the students. I didn't realize it was a modified curriculum. So as an advocate, which is what I do, I'm concerned that is he really going to be getting, in high school, be able to do the courses to get the credit, to get the diploma that he wants. Do you know what I mean? So I'm concerned about, like, when they, now it's a different, I know you said before that you can be getting promotion criteria either through diploma or progress on goals, right? But once you check progress on goals, isn't that automatically modified? So you're not aligning
It
with-
gives us some wiggle room, especially in elementary school. It gives us some wiggle room. So for a lot of like my special day class students,
They're in 8th grade now.
right, we would be checking progress towards goals to give us that wiggle room. They don't have to meet every single standard or take this specific test. So what's changed in California, and this is good for us right now, is that you used to have to pass an exit exam.
yeah.
Right? So it didn't used to even matter what courses you took up until 2010. You had to pass. So even if you were diploma track, if you didn't pass English, reading, math, English and reading, English, math, and writing, you did not get a diploma. So that has changed for us now, which has created this kind of in-between wiggle space.
Which is a different concept.
What I would say, okay, if you are at this point where you're like, I'm not sure, I'm confused about where my child is, I would say ask the school in writing and get their response in writing, and make sure that the IEP team, the college counselor are all on the same page and have that in writing. That would be it could be in the IEP notes. It was made clear, the parent asked, where the certificate versus diploma, yes, these courses count, and just ask that it be put in writing so that you feel really clear on what's happening. Because the tricky part is every school and every institution interprets things in a different way.
Okay, one basic question. When we say, or when one says that modified courses generally don't count towards diploma credit, who is saying that?
Well, it is the California Department of Education that sets the standards. And actually, we're going to get to that next. So the California Department of Education says, these are the standards, these are the 13 classes you need to take in order to get a diploma. Then it's the districts, and it gets a little tricky with private schools, and we're going to talk about that. Whereas if you're talking about a private school like Marin Catholic, they do not have to stick with what the state says are the standards, but they, as a private institution, up it, right? As opposed to when we look at schools like Star Academy, which is WASC accredited. So you know that they're also aligned with those 13 classes. But when you look outside of that, you have to ask those questions.
So it's based on the California Department of Education state standards
For graduation requirements, yes. And actually at the end of my slide, there's the website where you can look at exactly what those 13 are. So I think I'm going to continue, and we'll revisit some of this at the end, because some of these questions hopefully will be answered as we go. We talked about this already. Okay, so this is part of your question. The state sets the minimum. This is the California Ed Code. There are the 13 courses. You can read descriptions of them online. It's a fascinating website. And then the district is responsible for implementing those courses and what that course actually looks like, the curriculum, and then awarding the diploma. We talked about private high schools. Most are going to exceed those minimums because a lot of our children are maybe looking for state or UC level college experiences, and so those standards are even higher. So that's something, if you have a child who is looking at a state school or a university, you really want to think, okay, this minimum is not going to be enough. So what is the state saying? And again, my New York sister was like, 13 classes. I think it's 17 in New York. 3 years of English, 2 years of math, including Algebra 1, and that's the very specific solid language. 3 years of social science, 2 years of science. We have our 2 years of PE. And then 1 year, and it used to be just foreign language, but now we've opened it up. So it's either a visual performing arts, a foreign language, a career technical class. So there's a lot of options. And what I love is ASL is included as a foreign language for that requirement. So that's pretty exciting for some of our kids where learning a second language might be more challenging. Did you get it? It's a screenshot straight from the California Department of Education. I was going to type it out. I'm like, I can't. So these are the requirements. I went back and forth about deleting this slide about 30 times. There is an algebra waiver in theory, and according to the California Ed Code, they state it is a stringent review and approval process. My sister encouraged me to keep it in because she said, you know, while it's overall not recognized, some school, like, it's something to look into. So for those kids that we talked about, I haven't had a Marin experience where one has bin approved. Have you?
No, Marin does not recognize it, nor does Sonoma County.
Yeah. So maybe if you move, that's something to think about looking into that piece. Okay, so this is just a quick chart just to show that there is a difference in California. If you look at English as an example, while the 3 years of English will get your child to graduation, it will not be enough for it admittance into a state school. You need the 4 years. The same thing, I think the biggest piece, the biggest difference is the foreign language, where for graduation you have these other options. When we talk about a state or a UC, it's 2 years of the same language. So that's a big difference. And again, these are conversations to have based on your child's aspirations and based on what they can handle as well, right? For some, the foreign language is the barrier, and that's okay. They're going to start at a community college and go for a degree or a certificate and continue to move on from there. And I'm happy to share this with you guys if you...
It's here. There's a slide here.
Yeah, it's kind of small, but I'm happy to send a PDF of the whole presentation so you don't have to stress about it. Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you.
So if this child is working towards the state diploma,
Mhm.
the school district basically will give them, it's considered a diploma.
Right.
But it's not aligned with CSU and UC, then their only option is to go to junior college to make up those classes?
Or do dual enrollment while in high school to take the foreign language credit. If they stay at a school like STAR that we don't have the foreign language 2-year course offering because all of our kids thus far have gone to JC.
Okay.
So dual enrollment is definitely a possibility.
Mhm.
We're piloting this year with COM. We've got 5 high school kids enrolled.
So I guess kind of the question is, like, I feel like when you're in junior college, there's no IEPs in college kind of thing, right? So then how do you ensure, like, I would like to ensure that my child gets support under an IEP for as long as possible,
Mhm.
and that maybe he needs extra time to
Mhm.
complete that diploma. So like at 18, does that mean spending another year in high school to finish coursework? Like, what are the options, I guess, one, to get that UC diploma under an IEP with all the supports in place that the child needs, and then two, extending the runway. So can you address that at all?
Sure.
Or is that coming up later? I don't want to.
Well, I think there's a couple things to think about. One is that there absolutely, if your child is interested in a certain institution, the accommodations, the disability or accessibility service office is hugely helpful. Stormy at College of Marin and I were on like a daily chain. So there absolutely are accommodations. So that part is critical. I also, on the last slide, I have this great resource, which is the 50 top accessibility-friendly colleges in the country, which I found that list really fascinating about who really cares and puts students with disabilities on the top of their priority. So that's there as well. As far as extending the IEP, that really depends on your child's track, and so some students will be getting served until 22. Some students may need 4 years of Algebra 1, slowly building on each other to get there. But it depends on kind of where your child falls.
So I guess the question is, if the state diploma is what's offered at 18, they get the state diploma and it's like they're done, right?
So the diploma it's the same diploma in California, but it's more about the units and the credits. So when I talk about with this you can graduate. But with this alone, you will not have enough exposure to get in to these other schools. So like Sheila said, I have a student right now, she's a senior. She's taking 4 classes at her high school, and she is taking 3 JC classes, 2 of which are online, 1 of which is an online career planning course, which I'm actually loving because it's a lot of kind of the transition stuff. She's not a kid who has an IEP, but she darn well needs the support to figure out what she wants to do. So this course has been designed to help kids, and it's an online course. She gets double or 1.5 of the units because it's a college level course, and she has the freedom and flexibility to meet with a person to work on it. So there are tons of options. And I'm forgetting the website. You might know there's this amazing website that includes all online courses, JC courses. Anyway, I'll find it and add it to our resources. It's a really big help. Sorry?
What class is that?
The career planning, I think, is through Santa Rosa JC, but I'd have to double check on that for you.
Could you talk about what you mentioned earlier about if you go to COM, you have to wait to get to UC?
Yeah.
Because that was interesting.
So the question was, your daughter, Steve's daughter is in Compass, which is a dual enrollment, a high school student taking classes at the college. It's no problem. What we found, though, is that if a child starts at the junior college level, the UCs won't accept, or CSUs will not accept a transfer student until junior year. And there's I think it's a 60-unit requirement that they have to take. So if a child graduates high school, starts taking classes at the JC, maybe intended to do 1 year at the JC and then transfer, they cannot. It's a 2-year requirement and a minimum number of units required. That's a lot. That
60
surprised
units,
me.
yeah.
You know, it was really a shame, actually, I think, because some kids just need that 1 year and then they're ready to springboard. But just going into that, if your child does graduate from high school, start at a JC, knowing it's going to be 2 years before they can get in. Now, the upshot of that is in California, the JC system has a TAG program, TAG, which gives preferential enrollment to JC students for UCs, and it's a huge advantage. And the acceptance rate is far superior to what they would otherwise have access to if they tried to get in as freshmen. So, and really the bottom line is giving kids more time, especially kids with learning differences, is really what's going to serve them better, even though they might be chomping at the bit for more independence. That really is going to support them best.
Can I add a question to that? So if your student is taking college and Marin classes during high school, can that count towards those 60 credits that are required after you get your diploma? So in theory, you could take summer classes
Maybe do a year and a half versus 2 full
and
years.
build towards that.
Yeah, you should.
And I'll just add for informational purposes, I've heard that students who do that, they get all of their sort of core requirements done at the junior college. So once they go into, you know, Cal or something,
Mhm.
they're taking, what is it called? Major specific
Mhm.
classes. They're not spending their time fulfilling their
Great
science
point.
requirement.
Great point. And so those are, now they're in this more rigorous learning environment, but they're taking classes that are aligned with their wants and
Exactly.
and done with the English and the math. Yeah, that's a really great point.
Before you move on,
Yes.
can I just circle back to one thing that Audrey had said, and that was, at 18 is the district done when I have the diploma. And this is a piece I want parents to really hold and think about. If your child, so we talked about how to get your child to the degree pathway. If algebra is really a stumbling block for your student, and I know there is something psychologically really important to a parent and to children about getting that high school diploma, but there are ramifications to that in that the district's done with you at 18. They're not funding any more education. So if your child's really struggling, needs a 5th year of high school to round out their other academic subject areas, their social pragmatic skills, their executive functioning skills, see it not as a failure if they get a certificate of completion. So we have 4 post-secondary kids this year who are doing a 5th year of high school. And one of them, we are doing something totally out of the box with the algebra to try to see if we can get the student to that finishing point and a degree after 5 years of high school. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the real beauty for this kid is he got another year of high school. And we're doing a scaffolded college experience for him in addition to trying to see if we get there. But the algebra and the diploma from high school is not the goal. The goal is how do we best set this child up for future success down the road. Now, in some instances, I know your child's capacity, district will say no way. I think it'd be, if your child is clearly on track to get an algebra completion, it will be a very difficult battle, barring any physical needs that the child may have. That may be an exception area where you can advocate and get a 5th year of high school. But you're going to be hard-pressed to get the district to fund a 5th year of high school if your child can pass algebra and they know it.
Yes.
But
Really.
see, that's what, I think that, like, that's from like a learning perspective, but I look at so much on child's brain injury. So then it's like functional, like being able to plan, being able to, you know, all these, there's other skills that are involved with living, with going off to college or living independently that I think it's like, well, they're going to pass, he's going to pass algebra, he's going to get this diploma, and then goodbye, right?
Right.
So that's what I'm concerned about, and I feel like I work with adults who've had hemispherectomy. It's hard, the cognitive skills and that executive function. So that's where it's like, I just want to make sure what other supports, like he's going to need support in a lot of areas, not just in math, right?
Yep.
That's great that he's doing great in math, but then that's the concern is like then, and this is true of probably a lot of kids at 18, you know, it's like, well, they do still need more supports, and that transition plan, you know, like what happened in those 4 years to help them get to that next step and to make sure that it's really robust.
Right.
And that it's addressing all the areas of need. If they have a motor impairment, if they have planning issues, you know, whatever it is, social skills, all the stuff that they're going to do outside of the academics.
Absolutely. So I want to reiterate Sheila's point, which is so important, about what the door of the certificate opens. The school is not off the hook. The district is not off the hook. Now, there's positives and negatives to that. If you are a STAR parent, you have already gotten perhaps funded by your district. I think it's a more smooth process, would you say, to get that 5th year. Marin County, and I'm actually getting there, has their own programs to 22, which may or may not look like the program that fits for your child. So on the positive side, the certificate means I'm still getting support. And it's going to be focused on that transition, that living, that independence. Then it comes down to there are a ton of other options, and this is where this whole speaker series is going. The point comes to who's funding those options, right? So Integrated Community Services, for example, I'm just plugging all my PEP people today, is an organization that is completely committed to in the community support and services. They are funded by GGRC. So I'll just give you a recent example, and I can only speak to my direct experience. I had a client who has a high-functioning young man. He is very bright in school. He was denied Golden Gate Regional Center coverage years ago because he has a very high IQ. He is has some really almost genius level skills. She came to me about a year ago, because now he's in high school, and she said to me, I need to reapply for the regional center. There are so many other pieces that they missed when they did this first evaluation. So what we did was we really looked at all of his processing and at his day-to-day life. And what we discovered is there's 7 areas that GGRC looks at, and they have to show, and don't quote me on this, weaknesses in 3 or 4 of those areas in order to qualify. What we found was in his living, independence, and in all of these areas, he was not able to be independent. He had a real fear of food preparation, which is one example. An irrational fear, where he, at this point, is not able to prepare food for himself. That is just one example of the reason. I just got an email from her yesterday that he has actually been accepted as a regional center client. So in her case, and again, it's so individual, and she did have support helping her prepare for what to say when going through this interview process. But for her, if her son graduates, which he may, he has that capacity, with a diploma, he will get those independent living services from ICS because they're funded from GGRC. So this is the other piece to consider.
Does ICS start when he's 18, 19 to get funding from, or go to the regional, or does that start when he's 22?
Well, you never want to double dip. So usually it's whenever you're no longer supported by the school.
And
Although they do support.
Demarcation is diploma. What? Demarcation is diploma.
Or 22. Correct, yes. And Abby is also a part of our speaker series, so she is the best person to answer these questions. But yes, it's essentially diploma or 22, and that's when you're shifting over. But again, it depends. There's the Department of Rehab as well. They're more of a shorter term solution from my experience, whereas ICS will do a more longer term support system.
What's ICS?
Integrated Community Services, and that's also on the slide. They have other programs elsewhere, like sister programs, but yes, it is a Marin-based. Yes, Tech.
Looking at certificate track equals services simplistically to 22. Diploma track, obviously, like how we all grew up college. Now, we have our children, and everyone's got their individual differences, but obviously executive functioning skills, independent living and so forth is very key. And we're starting to see, and Doug Kramer, we spoke the other day, we're starting to see universities and colleges out there offering programs that are targeting towards students of IDD, call it that, where providing some form of executive or life functioning, independent living assistance into the college experience.
Right.
I guess it was this New York Times article, which Susan, you saw, I think a number of you have seen it, which there was like 265 and counting. I met
Program.
with some very senior folks over at Syracuse the other day, and they've got a program now with 60 kids and growing, where it's almost like they are going to have an aide with them to kind of just nudge it along and so forth. So it seems like there's more and more options out there.
Sure, absolutely. I think what it comes down to is who is funding the option.
Right.
And if you can, so with Marin County, for example, if your child was still under that umbrella of the Office of Education, you would have to show evidence and support as to why the program that they're offering, and they will offer their program because that is what is budget conscious and that is what's available. You would have to show why their program does not meet your child's needs and why this other program does. So the Star Academy 5th year program, which is taking off and hopefully going to continue, I know it's a pilot year. For example, if Marin County was to say, okay, we're recommending this placement on the Indian Valley campus and this is the pieces, and you as a parent, you must consider their option. That is, even though you don't want to. It's an important part of the process. I will carefully consider the option that you're suggesting. And I do this a lot as an advocate. I'll go with families and tour it. And what I'm looking at is what components of that program are or are not in place to meet my child's needs. And whether, if the program has all of those components, I would suggest you start by making a list. And I often do this with families. Here are the 10 things that my child needs to be successful in their 5th-year program. And then you go down that list and you inquire, does this program have in the community on-the-job training? Does it have one-on-one assistance going into a classroom if required, right? So if you're looking at an option that's outside, it comes down to who's going to fund it and how do you show that that program is going to meet a need for your child that another program wouldn't. And an example, NYIIT is a program in New York where it's fully open to all students. And again, in New York, you actually can't go to community college without a degree. You cannot go with a certificate of completion, which is just so mind-blowing. Whereas here, you can go to College of Marin, you can get a degree at College of Marin with a certificate of completion. And I had to reiterate that with Stormy. I was like, explain that to me slower. And I'm kind of getting a bit ahead of myself, what we know is that your child, regardless, can enroll in a community college. They can take credit towards a certificate or a degree. They can attend classes. Some of our kids, it's more about the social skills and getting used to a campus and navigating a classroom and how to talk to a professor. All of those. So for some of our kids, starting with a yoga class, starting with a study skills class is the best option, and then we're starting to build, right? So now the anxiety of just college has kind of gone to the wayside, and now we can focus on, oh my gosh, he's so good at science, let's try that. Because we've already taught him or her, in essence, how to be a student. So that's a huge part. And one thing that Stormy brought up to me in our communication lately that I thought was really fascinating is there's also certificates. So when you think about getting an associate's degree, it's about 60 units, right? And while your child, regardless of diploma or certificate, could pursue that, you also have to remember that there are general education requirements tied in with that diploma. So for example, to get an associate's, your child would need an English, a math, they would need to pass those general education classes. Well, another option is more of a certificate program, which is a great way to kind of jump into the job market. So one example is, well, first of all, there's a lot less units. So instead of the 60, you're looking at 10 to 20, depending on the program. It's focused on a specific area of interest for your student. It may not have those requirements of reading and writing and math, which may be the sticking point for some of our kids. And it can be employment specific. So one example that Stormy gave me was an early childhood certificate, where it's 10 units, they take these classes and they walk away, where they could maybe perhaps work at a daycare and say, oh, I have this certificate in early childhood, here are the classes I took, so it can be a real stepping stone to a career path. So that's a... Well, it just, I wouldn't say essentially vocational. I think it depends on the career and that's a huge point that I'm going to get to is what is the vision and what is the qualification for that career, right? Does it need a high school diploma? Does it need a bachelor's degree? Those are the questions. But I think this is for those kids who are not ready for that piece, this is a great stepping stone and option.
So community college, this certificate program, if your child has a certificate of completion from the high school, does the high school work with the community college as far as IEP and stuff like that, as opposed to if they get a diploma, then the high school stops and then you're only working with the community?
So this is a really good question. The power shifts. The power shifts to the child as their own advocate. Okay, so let's say you decide your child is going to go to Chico State. And first day, leading up to the first day, it is their decision whether or not to self-disclose their disability. So this is a huge piece of what we'll talk about at the next training is, identity, self-advocacy, because now it's not you running with the IEP to say, okay, here's my child. It really is your child making that decision. Do I disclose my disability? If so, I go to the accessibility office. Can I use my IEP as a guide? Yes, absolutely. Here are the accommodations I had that worked for me in the past. Is it a legally binding document like it was prior? It's not. So the accommodations are there, but it really is about working with the accessibility office, getting those accommodations, and then it's their job to disseminate those accommodations to the professors. And usually they're really good at helping identify which professors or teachers work really well with kids who need accommodations.
But there's no IEP in community college, and there are accommodations, but there are no modifications.
Correct.
And that's an important distinction because I think we were getting lost in the semantics earlier in this conversation about accommodations versus modifications. If you want to understand the differences, you will see it at the JC level. So they will give no accommodations. Won't be reduced homework,
No modifications.
Excuse me, no modifications.
Right.
But it's a very clear distinction, whereas here in our program, even if a child's here, and yes, we have a program that is absolutely aligned with the Common Core, especially the Diploma Track kids, no question about it, and the districts are acknowledging that, and they're issuing a district diploma. We have freedoms in terms of the pacing of such curriculum and how much time they might have to complete an assignment. So we have more wiggle room and more fluidity in how we can implement our curriculum. Not so at the JC level. In our maiden voyage with our first dual enrollees, class of dual enrolled students, and our post-secondary, it's a big learning curve for all of us. These are kids with learning differences, and they are in college, and that's for real, so we can't forget that. So the idea of starting in a certificate track program with a yoga class or with a college counseling class is a really good idea, because even not challenging academic content, it's challenging just learning how to navigate the campus and all the different professors and keep up with the social cues of all the conversations flying around them. Our kids have been kind of sheltered to some degree, so it's a big world out there. So start slow, even if it takes longer, even if it's a food handler certificate, whatever it is, and then keep pushing the bar forward.
I guess my question is, what's the difference between a certificate of completion? You mentioned that when you get a diploma from high school, then the high school district's responsibility ends completely. If you get a certificate of completion from high school, are there advantages to having that, especially going to the certificate program in the JCC or the junior
Right,
college?
so let me show you,
Will they blend will they work together, or is there some advantage to having a certificate?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you for my lead-in. So I'm going to speak specifically to College of Marin, but I definitely suggest that if you have interest elsewhere, to look into it. But as Marin County Office of Education, if they are your district, this is kind of the option piece. So there are placement exams. Again, I mentioned that the students have to satisfy all the requirements, including gen ed, to get a degree. I'm going to skip that for right now. So when we talk about the post-secondary options, so your child gets a certificate of completion. They are still under Marin County Office of Education until 22. They have the Transition Partnership Program. So this is 4 total classes, and yes, they do work. From my most recent conversation, a lot of the students are not only taking the classes within the self-contained model that are on the college campus, but many of them are also pushing into College of Marin courses. So there is a partnership happening. There's 4 total classes. Tour it. They're obviously going to give you your options. Tour it, see how you feel, see if it speaks to your goals for your child. And what's happening there is not only the employment and the job coaching, but also the College of Marin campus classrooms. And they're really helping to bridge that piece where they might push in and then help your child with the homework or this piece. So yeah, that is definitely an option.
And if you are graduate track, if you get a diploma track, you don't have access to that.
Correct. Yes.
Sorry, I got two questions.
Yes.
Hopefully be quick. So if one goes certificate track and you, I guess, go to the district and you, education, when you, let's say you win, you get services. Now, STAR offers this 5th-year program, call it a post-grad program, whatever it may be. If they want to push, suggest or recommend our kids go to Marin, or College Marin, but if there are these programs outside, like we talk about, there's this growing community of universities around the country that offer these specialized programs, is that something that the district will pay for if there's certificate track?
It's a complicated question. I would say it is not something that they will joyously agree to. Yeah. It comes back to what makes that program appropriate versus their offer. And what's tricky in special education is we have to provide educational benefit in the least restricted environment possible. We do not have to provide the Mercedes of education. And that is what is so frustrating as a parent and an advocate, because you want the Mercedes, you want the bells and whistles. So what it really comes down to is getting the right support to show your argument that this program has things that are going to meet your daughter's individual and specific needs that the other offer does not.
Do you have a hypothetical? I mean, could you walk through maybe a hypothetical on that? As far as what could perceivably be offered by the district? Because there's the education.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, there's two programs. So in Marin County right now, they're going to offer Grant Grover or they're going to offer Indian Valley campus. They're self-contained. They're like a special day class on a college campus. And so they have a scaffolded college experience for the students, and they'll take them through. And I believe there's a component of vocational training as well as the education training. But I think that where the scaffolding comes in is there's some, it's like SDC, really. There's someone with your student all day and taking them to and from. It's not an independent college experience. So that's IVC and Grant Grover's for students who have lower cognitive capacity and are taking less intensive academic classes. So for the kids we see here at STAR, some of them fit into one of those buckets, some of them don't fit into those buckets. And it's a dance with the district, and some are going to be more willing, and that's really why we have this program this year. We had a big graduating class last year, and some kids didn't fit into those buckets. And it was a very delicate dance we did over the course of the year to say what makes sense, what do these kids need, that's the start of the conversation, and then what can we provide within reason. And it just so happened that those things came together, and the district too saw the wisdom of that, and we had a win all the way around. But it's a hard conversation. I'd start thinking about it early, about go tour those programs, get a sense of what your child needs, get a sense of if that will work or what won't work, and then what else is out on the landscape. And I'd say the one thing that might increase the likelihood of success of getting such a program funded is look for a one-year placement. The district will be more likely to fund something outside of their box if they know they're not on the hook for the next 3 years. Because I think the folks at the district really have the intention of doing right by the kids, and there are tremendous pressures on them from the financial perspective, which is just the reality. So trying to find the reasonable middle ground is the way that I think you'd have the best chance of success.
Just if I can grab, thank you very much, Sheila. The second one, and maybe I'm dating myself here, but kids can go certificate track, diploma track, and let's just say it's going to take longer for your child, and you recognize that. Does that whole high school equivalency diploma that
The GED?
folks
that-
who've been incarcerated, they seem to be able to get diplomas. I mean, what's available for our kids, our children?
Sure, there's the GED is an option. Beyond that, I mean, you always have the opportunity to complete the high school. I think the GED is the most common option when you're talking about maybe long-term coming back to get that diploma.
Yeah, but once once you're in a JC setting and you're taking classes, it really becomes a moot point, to be honest.
Right.
You know, your child's not going to be hampered by not having that diploma. If the goal is to get to a 4-year institution and they do 2 years and 60 units at a JC, does not matter in California that they don't have a high school diploma. They can go to UC or CSU. That's the amazing thing.
So you're saying
Right.
certificate, junior college, college,
really
four-year,
Mhm.
or diploma, junior college, four-year college? Correct.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is not true in many other places. Many other places, you would not be able to even take a yoga class at a college campus without a diploma. So it really opens up
And that's
huge
true, not just in
opportunities.
this county, it's in the state of
Mhm.
California that we're talking about, okay.
Yes, Lori.
That was a lot of information. So, you can get a certificate of completion, go to a junior college, get an AA still?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And go on to get a bachelor's at a CSU or UC.
Okay, then backtracking for STARS program, you can get a 4-year certificate of completion, go on to the 5th year and get a diploma,
Maybe.
possibly,
Yeah.
if you're that close.
Yeah.
And then I was waiting to ask all 3 questions at one time, and I should have written them down.
It's okay.
Oh, I think maybe it was a comment. What we're struggling with is Maddie's on Diploma Track, and I think there's not a problem. What I'm looking at beyond that is what expectations are then held upon her when she goes out into the job market as to her capabilities.
Mhm.
You know, do you want to take the certificate of completion even if she's able to get a diploma? Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Because then, I don't know, then people might say, okay, she needs a little more handling, or she needs a little more, you know what I'm saying?
Well,
So
I think if your child is capable, the team is going to push for that. Absolutely, because it does open up. There are
Sure.
job opportunities where a high school
Yeah.
diploma is required. I'm not going to sugarcoat that.
Okay,
That's where the Department of Rehab might step in to support. That's
Okay.
where you're looking at local, and I know STAR's working, there's many organizations in Marin working very hard to make partnerships with businesses that are open and understanding of hiring people with
I
differences.
need to hear that, okay.
So that's a huge, I mean, in the last 5 years, is creating these relationships so that we can find places for our kids to work where there's an understanding.
Okay. No idea if this is related or not, 504s,
Mm-hmm.
is that what it's called?
Sure.
To further map out your, I'm not really sure, your kids' abilities, your kids' needs beyond an IEP, included in an IEP, is that another conversation?
So the reason I think why people get fixated on the 504 is because the 504 is not solely related to education, it's a civil rights law. So the 504, it spills into all walks of life, meaning, and this is true for any of your children because they have a disability. So if your child was excluded from something in life due to their disability, and that organization had any federal funding whatsoever, that could mean like a bus, or there would be repercussions that you could take legally through a 504. The IEP is the legal document that has the services attached. It has kids with 504s are in the same boat when they get to college, where they're, okay, I had a 504, I might need an accommodation, but it's not like you want to go get yourself a 504. Like the IEP supersedes the 504. It's more timeline based. It has more legal ramifications.
Is the 504 related to graduation of diploma?
Children with a 504 would not require like they would be on a graduation track unless for other reasons. So when you have a 504, it's because you need accommodations, but it's not impacting your ability to access your education, right? So you might have a child on a 504, for example, who has attention differences, but they're able to cognitively and academically complete all the work. So they're not taking modified classes, they're getting accommodations to help with their energy. Does that make sense? So yeah, it is a bit of a separate conversation, but for you guys, not really something to be
apply.
concerned
Okay.
of right now.
Got it.
Yes.
Colleen, just really quick.
Yes.
We've lost our camera crew, they're taking a snack break,
Yeah.
so stay right where you
Okay.
are. Okay.
That's really hard for me.
Yeah, right there. Anywhere in that range, you're good.
Okay.
You've got a few feet to walk.
I'll try. You can edge me if you need to. I'm not good at standing
If I
still.
go like this, it means move back in there.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
I think this is, I'm speaking to a concern of a few of us who are here from Gray. We've been trying to find out more about the programs that are available outside of the Grant Grover, Indian Valley, and there's a presumption in the high schools that this is where your kid is going, and if they're not going there, it's up to you to take care of things. And it's something that I've brought up, you know, and a number of us are addressing it again, that, you know, there are schools that are visiting Drake campus, for example, that have these, you know, they've seen the light. There's pathways at UCLA,
Right.
there's something at Syracuse, University of Iowa. They're creating these schools within the school. And first of all, put aside the fact that you may or may not get funding from the district. I see it as an attorney that it's really a civil rights issue. They make absolutely no effort to even open that door for our kids and try and, you know, work with us. It's just shut down. This is where you're going, and that's what you have to deal with. So that's one part of the picture that's very annoying for a number of us. And then the other thing that I found that different counties or districts are far more generous with funding programs, extracurricular programs. For example, I have a friend lives in the East Bay, and their daughter got a certificate and went to the top school down in Bakersfield. The school district covered that without kicking and screaming. And I get the feeling that, you know, you really have to gird yourself for battle with the MCIE. And from what I've heard, and of course I can stand corrected, they really are reluctant to give you anything outside of what they're offering at Indian Valley or Grant Grover in terms of funding anything. So that's my...
I hear your concern, and I think it is an individualized education plan, and I always come back to that and to thinking about what is offered and what your child really needs. And it's like Sheila said, it is a very, you know, we have a district and a lot of people on the ground who really care about the kids. And are there budget limitations? Absolutely. Is there different cultures even within Marin in regards to school districts and how they handle that sort of thing? Absolutely. But it really, for me, it comes down to gathering your facts about what your child needs, what the program offers, what is or is not there. And that's really the important part, because we're so emotional about it, but it really does, of course we are, but it really does come back to those, why isn't it? If you go and you consider an offer, this is in any circumstance with a child with an IEP, and you consider an offer and you observe and you talk to the teacher and you get a sense for the kids and you walk away and say, this is not the right fit for my child, why? What is there or not there that your child needs to be successful? And the key is to access their education. It's not to be, that's what's tricky about educational benefit. And there have been recent legal decisions that have said we do not have to accept the minimus, right? The minimal growth. But that idea was so ingrained in our circuit for so long that it's a new wave of what does educational benefit mean and what does reasonable progress mean in a program. So you're right, it's
and just to follow on, you know, the goal, I think, for whether you have a neurotypical kid or a special needs kid, the goal is independence. And what a lot of the what I've seen through friends of mine who had kids in the Indian Valley program, it doesn't build independence. It's still, it's not a real independence building program.
And I think the more of us, the more people in our community that speak about what maybe our specific kid doesn't fit in those buckets like Sheila was discussing, and what that would look like to help, because it's a systemic change. We need more options, and we have so many more kids with disabilities moving out into these successful arenas, and we need more choice. And I think that is happening, and things are exploding, but it's about also helping to define what that would look like. What would the program that would be perfect for your child as a part of the MCOE umbrella, what would that look like? And how do we help to shape that vision? And it's frustrating because I have a lot of parents fighting, pushing for that inclusion type model that may not see that perfect result for their child, but it's constantly moving us forward as a group.
I mean, we're all here, clearly it's a path for success for our children, yet we all have our children have their individual needs that they're going to be different across the board here. You mentioned something earlier as far as just information, the app, for example. There's a lot of great points that came across. It seems like is there, and I don't know if there's something that you guys have, for the next slide or two, that's kind of the questions that we need to ask for these,
For when we tour.
Sorry?
Questions that we need to ask when we're touring the Indian Valley program.
Whether it's you start talking about the IEP just to be short. You talk about the 10 things why what your child specifically needs versus what the county may or the district may be offering. What are those? If we don't have any kind of direction, we can have
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I do have some questions to ask, but not necessarily specific to that point. If you write that down for me, I think that would be a great, just a list of 10 things to be looking for, and where, because it's going to be very individual, like you said, but there are, some keys. Yeah, absolutely.
One suggestion, go back to your child's IEP, an area of need as documented, the multiple areas of need as documented in the IEP. As much as you can link it to what's already legally and as a designated need and in writing that the district already agreed to, go ask them early on, I'd like to see all the post-secondary options you would consider offering to my child. Go see every one of them. I think your point earlier was a great one. Here's the 10 things this program must have. Evaluate it from that lens. Have your child go to. The district needs to see a good faith effort to evaluate the programs. Sit down with the district. Here is our feedback on these programs and why. And here's what I think would work. Make it as easy as possible for them to say yes. And so if they don't have to rebuild a wheel and come up with something when they have nothing and they're stressed and they're under the gun and they're worried about getting sued, it sets up a negative scenario. But if you've done your legwork with as open mind and as objective of a filter as you can, and your child's been there with you because they're not concerned when they're 18 and they're in this conversation, you're setting it up for the best chance of success.
And make it collaborative, not combative.
Absolutely. And I think what will happen is, if this pattern happens, it's a costly thing for districts to provide anything outside of what they house, right? It's costly. So what will start to happen is we'll start to see, oh my gosh, there is this area of need that's not being met, and we need to put our efforts into creating something for this group, because we had 10 kids this year who didn't fit in these spots. And I think that's the long-term evolution that we're looking for. And the more that we're concrete and spell it out, the easier it's going to be for these programs to take off the ground.
Can you go to the financial aid?
Yeah, thank you.
Because that goes to the question that I had. We kind of spelled out what's good about the certificate track. What's good about having a diploma? We talked about the social or the emotional liability, and also some jobs require a
Yep.
diploma. What other pros are there for getting the diploma, other than maybe going to another state and not having that? Why would we want to do a diploma track as like financial aid?
Sure, sure. So this is one thing that did come up, and there is federal versus state financial aid, so I want you to keep that in mind. But for example, the Pell Grant is a federal financial aid give, and if your child has a certificate of completion, they will not qualify for a Pell Grant. I do know that some institutions have exceptions to that, and Santa Rosa JC is one of them, so this is just something to keep in mind while you're planning. So yes, one positive of the diploma is you're not going to be limited in regards to financial aid. You're going to have more options in regards to community colleges even, because if you were to travel out of state, and I keep bringing up New York because that's where I'm from, but if you were to move to New York, your child would not be able to go to a community college there. I would say thinking about your child's vision and career needs, there are, you know, I know that Abby will say a lot of the jobs that she works with and the relationships she has, it's a non-issue in regards to they'll take a child who has a certificate, but that's not in the big picture of things, oftentimes that is a prerequisite for a job, so that's something to think about. Again, I brought up the GGRC, right? So if you are a regional center client and you do get the school is done with you, you do get a diploma, you then would be able to access more of their services. So it's the change in the funding.
Before 22.
Before 22, yes, thank you for clarifying that.
Is there a way to find out which states or which agencies, other than going to each individual place to find out if they accept the certificate? Would you say a handful of states don't accept the California certificate, or is it most other states? Or is
You
there
know, I have a guidance counselor contact that I can ask about that. That is a question I'm not sure on the 50 states what our percentage is.
I don't have that exact answer either, but there is a group called Think College, specific to students with disabilities. They have a wonderful website and portal and tons of information. I'm sure they would have
Okay,
such a list.
perfect. Think college. I'll have to add that. Yeah.
So if the goal is college for my child, back to this diploma question, so if the A to G diploma is offered in the placement he would be in if he wasn't here, but there's no A to G diploma here, isn't that like not LRE? Like if that's his goal is to go on to a four-year college and that's not an option, how does that,
I think it comes back to seeking, does the school make it accessible for him to take those classes elsewhere? Would that be the response? So making sure that there aren't barriers up where, oh no, we just don't do Spanish and there's no option to take Spanish.
But taking it outside on your own initiative and your own extra time, extra classes, and not having it be part of the curriculum is not the same as having it be in, you know what I mean? Like it's not offered.
That's why we did the dual enrollment,
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
is the foreign language, was the impulse for that.
Yeah.
So that's exactly why. So we're allowing time in the child's
What
academic
happens
day
with transportation
to
and
go,
stuff like
we
that?
take the kids back and forth. It's created a part of their academic program.
And I think what happens is as the need develops, programs also evolve because it's really difficult to offer a Spanish class, and this is for MCOE as well. We need to show the need to offer a Spanish class if only 2 students would take it. It's not a good use of resources. Whereas,
We do see that changing in the future, and our goal will be to have a Spanish class so we can have a full complement as our population is now shifting, and we have seen a big shift from the majority of kids before, and looking back at the STARS trajectory in years past before I was here was much heavier on the certificate track, and now I see that pendulum swing completely to the other side and be much heavier on the diploma track.
They talk about, I mean, one of the early things going certificate track is that there's a lot of, services that are afforded your child until 22. Now, if your child goes diploma track and then goes off to some form of educational institution somewhere, if they still need some level of support, is that where like the GGRC comes in? I mean, what kind of support is afforded the diploma track child, the diploma child who needs something?
yeah, so that would be where the accessibility services on campus would come in. I know some have tutoring groups, writing centers, social events, and I think that top 50 really outlined what colleges have similar things in that way. That might be where you enlist with Department of Rehab. GGRC would probably hook you up with ICS. Now we have Artistry Studios, which is a vendor. So they have programs. So it's blossoming, and luckily through this whole series, you're going to learn more and more from those representatives, because there really is. It's almost here. It's like this wealth of information that it's too much. It's like trying to figure out who does what and at what age and who pays for it and what does it look like. So having those vendors to speak for themselves is a huge piece.
Having a nice book, really.
Well, maybe this is just the beginning of our book that we're. Sure.
Quick thing is, it's a complicated landscapes, and GGRC and DOR, these are institutions that can be tricky to navigate and understand. So while Colleen's absolutely right, and we're working with some of these vendors, ICS being one, DOR being another, and trying to bring this into our high school curriculum and have our parents educated on it early, it is an imperfect landscape. There are holes. Like for the social pragmatics piece, that's a hole, that's a deficit from what I see, is having ongoing social supports and opportunities for kids with learning differences to have meaningful relationships long term. So there are places where now, as we're entering this post-secondary space, looking for what are those holes, what are those needs. Stormy Miller, who's the Director of Student Accessibility Services at College of Marin, I recruited her to be on our board this year, the next 2 years, so she can help us really define better what are the holes, what are the opportunities, where can we provide services, or where can we link up and better seek grant monies to better fill some of these holes. And your feedback too is going to be really helpful for us to understand what you're looking for, what you think your student needs, and what yet doesn't exist.
Absolutely.
This also gets to be very county specific, correct? Not just state specific. There's state specific and then county specific. So it's
absolutely
bigger issue.
What about assessment? So I'm requesting an ITP for my son this year. I've heard that they're not necessarily that great through the district. So I've heard of the California Diagnostic Center does some. Are there IEEs available for ITPs? How do you do, like, what does that assessment process look like?
Sure.
When you start it? What are the, kind of what are the options?
Yeah, I would honestly say it's probably the most loose in regards to assessment. There are absolutely formalized, standardized assessments, like interest inventories and skill set, where you can look at that piece. Some of which is typical college career planning, but then there's specifically ITP instruments, and I have a few that I can jot down for you, but it is a more loosely created assessment. I would say we're also not only considering transition, but we're looking at the psychoeducational assessment as a whole. We're looking at the processing, we're looking at the education, we're looking at the ability to organize and plan, all of those pieces. So I wouldn't just look at an interest inventory when I'm talking about ITP. I'm looking at their last psychoeducational review.
Well, he's getting it all this year.
Yeah,
So I
perfect.
asked for it all.
Absolutely.
So but I just want to know, like, I normally, if I don't like the evaluation, I'm just going to ask for an IEP, but I don't even know if that exists for a transition plan, right? Or where would I go to get more information about what should be involved and what, how do I, so basically it's like, how do I know what plan I want my child to have for high school if I don't know even what his what his potential is, or
Sure.
that's kind of what I'm looking at.
Sure, absolutely. So that is, an individualized service that I can provide, having seen hundreds of ITPs and what poking the holes as far as like what makes sense and what doesn't. As far as an IEE for an ITP, that may be an untapped arena.
Yeah, IE and
Individual
ITP.
educational assessment where you ask the district to pay for a private assessment at their expense if their assessment wasn't comprehensive or valid.
Right.
So there is someone in Southern California, Dr. Gary Green, who does IEP transition plans, but he's in Southern California.
Sure. So essentially when you think about any time your child is assessed, your procedural safeguard, your parent rights, state that you have the ability to contest. So for example, if you feel a decision was made based on the evidence from one instrument, oftentimes it happens if a child doesn't qualify for a service, for example. You have the right to request up to one independent evaluation per evaluation that you disagree with. So what that looks like is the district can either A, agree with your request, and that would be on them financially, or B, can disagree with your request, outline why, and that would initiate a due process scenario. I would say in the past, in my experience, it used to be more often where the district would agree because sometimes it was just easier, even if they didn't truly agree with where you were coming from. More now, I'm seeing districts disagree and will write a letter as to why the person was qualified, why the assessment was correct. And then we'll give you a chance to either withdraw your request or they will move to due process. And that's the tricky part as parents. Due process is not where we want to be. We want to collaborate and make decisions. So yes, that would be an interesting crossroads. Have you experienced an individualized ITP, an IEE for an ITP?
Oh, no, not an IEE for an ITP.
What's an ITP?
So that was the individualist transition plan that we talked about. That's begins at age 16. Yeah, for all of this planning.
She was asking about like the IEE, but it's just like there's IEEs for everything else, but I haven't been able to find anyone who can evaluate privately for a transition.
I see, you want to do the IEE for the ITP.
there you go.
Northern California Diagnostic Center, because I've heard kind of mixed. I've heard they do transition assessments because he's really a neurologically complex and multiple disabilities, not just a learning disability. So I just want to make sure we're looking at everything and that they're not just saying, well, he's going to get past algebra.
So with the diagnostic center, it has to come from a referral from the school. It's not something where you can go directly to and they do, their experience is vast. And I've sat with them with very complicated children and had some really amazing aha moments as a teacher. But that would be something I would approach in a collaborative way with your district to say, listen, I really want to get the diagnostic center involved. Here's why, here's what we've noticed in the past through our evaluations. Here's the conflicts that we've seen and the difficulty. And I would honestly say that they would be more willing to go that route as opposed to a post. They give their assessment and then you don't agree and you want a private IEE.
I would do that.
Yeah. So I do want to respect everyone's time because it is 11. It's so funny. And I was looking at these slides like, this is not going to be 2 hours. But the questions, and I get it, I think all the questions were really meaningful and helpful and have also brought up a whole host of new questions for us, which is great moving forward when we plan our future events. But I'm happy to stick around if you have a couple of individual questions. But thank you guys so much for coming.
Where was the list of this?
Oh,
It's on there.
it is.
On the last.
Oh, let me just end with this. I do love this quote. This is a research study I came across about expectations. Research shows that parents who expect, and I put that in quotes because the research was not that the child actually went to college. It was the expectation that they would go to college, that their achievement was higher in high school than those who were not expected. So regardless of what path your child is on, I just want to wrap up with that point that expectations are so key. And then, here's our selling ourselves for our next events. Next is the Self-Advocacy, and Dr. Maggie is amazing in regards to her research and identity. But here are the resources, and there's tons more, so maybe I'll just add to that list based on some of Sheila's input as well.
And you're going to send that on to Star?
Yes, I think it's already on the Facebook page.
Oh,
Okay.
But thank you.
Is it easy to get a copy of the presentation, like big font, single page versus this? Is there a way to?
Not on a single page because there's so much text.
No, not on a single page.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the whole PDF, 1 slide per page. Yes, absolutely. I think I sent that.
Lisa's got your email, who's got your email?
Yes, it is small, it is tiny, but I'm like, how many trees can I kill for one presentation? I mean, the IEP is enough trees. I'm like, oh my gosh. So, all right. Well, and thank you guys for your amazing help getting us live.